Hey guys, seeing as this is my first video, I might as well give a brief introduction. I'm Chris, and I made this channel to entertain you guys with short stories. This story in particular I wrote myself, but I don't plan on them all being like that. So without further ado, let's get into the story. It's June 1963, and Desmond has just graduated high school in Los Angeles, California. Now, he always preferred to work with his hands and didn't see the point of finishing high school, but he did it anyways because he didn't want to be looked down upon for dropping out. Desmond's father owned a very successful real estate company and one day envisioned his son to take over. However, Desmond, liking to work with his hands, envisioned something quite different. Something like carpentry, for example. But whenever he would bring this up to his father, he would just scoff and say, "I didn't build a multi-million-dollar company just for you to become some lowly carpenter." In the following weeks after his graduation, Desmond and his father would continually argue about his career path now that he had no obligations, and his father wouldn't exactly leave a lot of room for compromise. One night, fast asleep, Desmond has a glimpse, or maybe a premonition. He's standing in this luscious, wide-open field with the sun shining all around him, and then he sees these children running around him, screaming and laughing, happy as can be. Then he looks over to his left, and he can see this enchanting figure dismount their horse, silhouette glowing in the setting sun. And as this figure walks toward him, he can tell that it's a young woman, and his eyes just get wide, and she just giggles and prances away. As he goes to pursue her, he trips on a rock, and as he hits the ground, he's startled to wake in his bed. Sitting up in bed now, realizing it was a dream, he focuses on the warmth he felt. And even though the dream was very brief, he had this overwhelming feeling that he was a part of something bigger than just himself. In that very moment, he decided that he would go someplace where he could feel that feeling again, no matter what the cost. And he decided the first step in achieving this was leaving the big city. He leapt out of bed, grabbed his hiking bag, and made sure only to pack what was necessary. He packed some spare cash, and he made sure to leave a letter on his bed to his parents detailing that he was going on a special mission and he would let them know once he found what he was looking for. He begins walking, but shortly realizes that he's not going to be able to get where he needs to go only on foot. So he sticks out his thumb and gets into the first car that pulls over for him. For the next 2 months, Desmond would do that over and over, depending on the hospitality of others to survive. And eventually his cash got so low that he would have to sleep under bridges and in abandoned houses just to get by. One day, Desmond is getting out of a car, and before he closes the door, he asks the driver, "What state are we in?" To which the driver replies, "Kentucky." As Desmond walks down this desolate dirt road, he takes in a deep breath, admiring the purity of the air, something he had never experienced for the first 18 years of his life in the big city. Another thing he has never experienced is seasons, and as he looks around, he sees these trees that are yellow, brown, red, and he's just speechless. As he continued walking, he thought to himself, why would something so marvelous fade so quickly? But this reminds him of a more pressing issue, and as he unfolds his wallet, he finds nothing. It dawns on him that if he continues, he's going to face starvation, hypothermia, or both, and so he realizes he needs to hunker down for the winter. He looks around him, and he sees this sign 100 meters in the distance. It's really shabby looking, but he makes it out that it says, "Help Wanted," and he just thanks the heavens. Oh my gosh. He can't believe his luck, and he immediately walks down the driveway. As he's walking down this driveway to this old Victorian home, he realizes that it's a horse farm. And when he talks to its owner, Emily Allen, he's hired almost instantly. Desmond enjoys his first hot shower that he's had in weeks and changes into some fresh clothes that the Allens were kind enough to spare him. He joins them for dinner, introducing himself to everyone, and he takes a mental note that there's no men in the family. It's only Emily Allen and her 2 daughters, Julia and Barbara. He estimates that Mrs. Allen is roughly in her mid-40s, and her 2 daughters are roughly his age, give or take a year. The following few days were a learning curve to say the least. Being a city boy, he was not used to this kind of hard physical labor, and he was totally out of his element. In particular, though, he was struggling with taming the animals, and one day he was taking a horse from one stall to another to clean it when it started being very rambunctious, snorting and stomping its feet, when Barbara rushes in and calms it right down. She grabs Desmond's hand and starts guiding it over the horse's head, teaching him exactly how to calm down the beast. And not only was he very amazed at her natural talent with animals, but he was also very intrigued by her as a person, and he could sense that she felt the same way. Every day after his chores, Desmond would hang out with the 2 girls and they would go swimming on the lake that was on the property. Also on the property was this narrow and deep river that fed into the lake, and the trio's favorite activity was to jump in it and then get shot out into the lake. But above all, Desmond's favorite activity was going on long walks in the forest with Barbara. Even though Desmond wasn't an academic, he was still a very deep thinker, and he loved having philosophical conversations, a passion that Barbara shared. They had amazing chemistry, talking for hours about topics like politics, relationships, and their futures. The 2 found themselves getting ever attracted to each other, eventually sharing a kiss stargazing one night. That night, Barbara tells Desmond the news. She's moving away. She goes on to explain how she's always dreamed of starting her own business, and so she enrolled in the University of Florida, pursuing a degree in exactly that, leaving in 3 days. Even though Desmond expected this at some point, he was still completely dumbfounded by this revelation and even felt slightly betrayed, thinking to himself, how could you leave now when we just spent the better part of a year getting to know each other? But eventually, he just sighed, put his hand over Barbara's and said, I hope you know I'll miss you. In his room that night, he sits on the edge of his bed, contemplating how much he actually meant that statement, and how he already misses her so much, wondering if he may even love her. Defeated, he flips off his light and goes to sleep. Without Barbara on the farm, the workload began to build, but so did Desmond's relationship with Julia. A lot of activities that used to be exclusive to Barbara and him are now exclusive to him and Julia. When he would be working around the barn, Julia would bring him fresh-made sandwiches and lemonade whenever possible. And one night, Julia takes a bottle of wine from the cellar and offers to share it with Desmond. As they got increasingly intoxicated, Julia flat out admits that she had a major crush on Desmond before Barbara left, and even let it slip that she was jealous by how much attention he gave her. At first, Desmond had only thought of Julia as Barbara's silly little sister, especially after that night's revelation. But as days turned into weeks, turned into months, she eventually grew on him. What started out as tolerance turned into respect, and respect eventually turned into like. At this point, Barbara had been out of school for 4 years and had still not returned home. Everyone had just figured that she started a business in Florida and was never going to return. At this point, Desmond was now 27 years old and again was at a crossroads in his life. Although he had now become very close with Julia, he was at a point in his life where a farmhand's salary had no longer become satisfactory, and he even contemplated leaving it all behind. And then it happened. It was a warm January evening and Mrs. Allen was on her way home from a night out with friends, and it was a torrential downpour. She was fiddling with the radio and in doing so drifted into the other lane where she was struck head-on, dying instantly. 2 officers came to bear the bad news, and while Desmond tried to calm down Julia, it was to no avail. Things had just dramatically changed for Desmond. He even thought to himself how selfish he could have been to want to leave. The Allens took him in when he had nothing and formed him into the man that he is today. They were practically family, and now they needed him more than ever. Once the initial shock passed, Desmond and Julia decided to bury Mrs. Allen in the cemetery that was located on the property. In doing so, Julia grabs Desmond's face and says, "If I die, promise me you'll bury me right beside my mom. You're all I've got." He was so shocked by this statement, he just put his hands up and said, okay, I promise. He thought of how silly it was to request something like this, especially at her age, but let it go, just chalking it up to the paranoia because the incident was still pretty fresh. They sent a letter to Barbara's last known address detailing what happened and where the funeral would be held and at what time, but they didn't expect a response. Ironically enough, it was the death of Mrs. Allen that ended up bringing Desmond and Julia closer together. And he even thought to himself, once this is all over, I'm going to ask for Julia's hand in marriage. Since he knew it was going to be very cold during the time of the funeral, and he wanted to cheer Julia up, he went into town and virtually spent all of his savings on this beautiful fur coat for Julia. When he gives it to her the night before the funeral, she gives him a massive hug, saying that she's going to wear it everywhere to show her appreciation for his kindness. Finally, the day of the funeral arrives, and it's only Desmond, Julia, the priest, and a select few family friends. As the priest begins his homily, Desmond sees a black figure slowly moving towards them, and he glances over, and he's just shocked. He's in disbelief. He can't believe who it is. It's Barbara. Once the funeral is over, the trio wastes no time in catching up. But Julia and Desmond look at Barbara slightly concerned, saying, "Why are you back?" Barbara explains that she started her own successful business in Florida as a wedding planner, but once she received the letter detailing what happened, she had a change of heart. While she was doing these gigs for big-time actors and business moguls, her own mother had died from a freak accident, showing her how precious time really was. And so she gave up fame and fortune because those things had made her forget where her true loyalties really should lie. That night, after the funeral, the trio sat by the wood stove, drinking wine, laughing, and reminiscing about the good old days. And then Julia abruptly suggests, "Hey, why don't we go skating for old time's sake?" And Barbara and Desmond just look at each other, shrug, and say, "Okay, why not?" Julia is the first to the lake, immediately putting on her skates and skating out onto the ice, and once the other two are satisfied, they join her. They chase each other around, shouting and laughing, just as they had done all those years ago. At one point, Desmond broke off from the girls, paused, and looked up into the night sky in bewilderment of how he got to where he was and how he was surrounded by such great people, but his thoughts were interrupted by screams. He whirls around, only to find that the girls had both fallen through the ice. Desmond stands in the family cemetery, taking the roses from his son's hand and placing them gently over Mrs. Allen's grave. His son softly asks, "Who's that?" pointing to the headstone right next to Mrs. Allen's. He kneels down, scooping up his son, telling him that that was his mother's sister. "How did she die?" he asks. Desmond points to the lake down the hill and says, "She died in that lake down there. She fell through the ice and drowned." Intrigued, his son asks, "Why did she drown?" Now initially Desmond was very annoyed by his son pushing the subject, but eventually he sighs and goes on. "It was the night after your grandma's funeral, and myself, your mother, and your aunt had decided to go skating on the lake down there. Now I had gone off by myself, and when I turned around hearing screams, I saw that both women had fallen through the ice. Now when I skated over, I immediately knew I had a massive problem on my hands, because they fell in right where the river connected with the lake, meaning there's a very strong undertow pulling them both under. Now immediately I knew that I could only save one, because as soon as I would pull out one, the ice would break where the other is holding on to, immediately sucking them under. So I randomly picked one pair of hands, I pulled them up, and as soon as the ice broke, the other person got sucked down, and that just so happened to be your aunt, and she was never seen again." At first, the boy just stared at his father in shock of how truthful and raw his answer really was, but then softly said, "It's okay, Dad. You did your best, and besides, how could you possibly know who you were saving?" And then Desmond gives a slight nod, and they both walk out of the cemetery. But that's the problem. He did know the whole time. Since he gave that fur coat to Julia, she was truthful in the fact that she wore it everywhere. And even in the dark, he could tell one pair of wrists had fur cuffs on them, and the other didn't. As the two walked out of the cemetery, the little boy turns his head to read the name on the headstone, and here's what it read. And suddenly, that incident at the lake takes on a whole new meaning. That's all for today. Let me know in the comments section what you thought. Is Desmond a murderer, or is he just a victim of circumstance? Also, if you made it to the end of the video, I appreciate you, and I'll see you all in the next video.